Coming up next on Public Access TV is Fan to Fan, the book game, where we chat with authors about some very interesting books and how they made them happen. Today, my guest is Robert Wallace, author of Machine Guns and Typewriters, a novel of a true story about a 1930s Needham bank robbery involving machine guns. Stay tuned, but be warned, you could get gunned down, but don't bank on it. Welcome to Fan, the book game. Hi, my name is Dave Hornfischer. I'm a fan of books, and I'm proud to be the host of this interview show with authors about their books and how they got them done. Today, my guest is Robert Wallace, author of Machine Guns and Typewriters, a novel of a true story about a 1930s Needham bank robbery involving machine guns. Robert, welcome to Fan.
Thank you for having
book
me.
Game. So this is kind of a nasty subject for a game, I guess. But why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you and what led you into becoming an author?
Well, I'm a Massachusetts native. I grew up in Needham in Medfield, and I went to high school at Severian in Westwood, and I went to Stonehill College in Easton. And I grew up a sports fan such as yourself, and have always had an affinity towards sports. Wasn't athletic enough to do anything with that. And so when I was in college, I volunteered at a local production studio in Needham. And that was where I cut my teeth doing production. I did some stuff in front of the camera. I did some stuff behind the camera. Fate kind of determined for me that I was probably better behind the camera. And so I became a producer, production assistant. When I was at the Needham channel, I started off as a volunteer, worked part-time. And by the time I graduated, I was working full-time as a production assistant. And then after I left there, I followed the sports model. And I worked at ESPN in the remote production side. And
I was
in Bristol,
Yeah.
But I traveled all around.
Yeah.
And I worked mostly on the National Hockey League. I did some Olympic trials. I supported Major League Baseball, Wednesday Night Baseball, and did a lot of studio stuff to support half times and intermissions. In pregame shows. And from there, I have worked for sports technology companies. I have worked for the local affiliates here in Boston. I was a sports producer at Channel 4. And I was executive producer of the sports department at Channel 7. And I have worked in the newspaper industry on the digital side out at the Orange County Register in California. And these last few years, I've spent a lot of time on the OTT and streaming side of live sports. So a little bit of mix of technology and storytelling and live sports, kind of bringing it all together.
You're doing some consulting now, you said, in this business.
I'm doing a little bit of consulting, and you have to figure out a way to pay the bills.
Okay.
When you write your first book, you're not going to hit the home run right out of the gate unless you're really fortunate.
And you did a documentary about Kurt Gowdy somehow. You were connected to that.
Yeah, so I was coordinating producer at Nesson at the time, and I was in charge of studio production and news. And
Kurt
passed away during that time. This was about, I forget the exact year. I want to say it was 2006. And he passed away, and the head of programming for Nesson came to me and said, this is an icon in New England.
Sure was.
We need to do something about, Kurt, and we need to tell a story. So we came up with the idea of doing a documentary, and we called it Kurt Gowdy, Cowboy at the Mic. And we were able to interview his son, Kurt Gowdy Jr., who also had an amazing career in sports broadcasting. And I remember at the time, I was like, you know, it would be so great if we could get some Narragansett paraphernalia in this studio so that we could do some shoots, because Hi Neighbor was his, you know, Hi Neighbor, have a Gansett was his catchphrase.
Shores of Lake Cochituate.
And so we contacted Narragansett Beer, and they actually became the presenting sponsor of the documentary.
Oh, great. Okay.
It was really my first foray into long-form writing at the television level. I had written teases and features and things like that, but I had never written something that extensive.
Sure. This was an hour-long show?
It was... Boy, it's so long ago. I might be wrong either way that I tell you, but it was either 30 minutes or 60 minutes.
Okay.
I have a feeling it was probably 60 because there was so much to tell, because he wasn't just Boston Red Sox baseball.
Oh, no, he became national.
He was the NFL. Like he was really everything.
Yeah,
so there was so many stories.
He was Joe Buck before there was Joe Buck.
Yeah, there were really so many stories that we had to tell, and I was fortunate enough to get nominated for an Emmy Award in writing for that, so I was really proud of that.
Yeah.
But that was really my first foray into long-form writing before this.
And so then how did that lead you to Machine Guns and Typewriters? You mentioned a Needham connection, so I could guess that had something to do with it.
Yeah, so I'll give a little tease here so people will stay with the whole show in case I'm not interesting enough. But I have a personal connection to the story that I'll reveal later. You'll have to remember to follow up with the question at the end. But I have a personal connection to the story. And so it was something that I've known since I was a lot younger. And writing a book was something that I felt like I wanted to do for myself. It was a bucket list item.
And this was a story that you felt was in you. My son was like that when he came to writing his first book. He was...
Yep.
I've heard this story all my life, and I want to know more about it, right?
Yeah. I have lots of ideas for books in my head. Some people will say that my book is probably a traffic jam of ideas. But this one, I was always determined that if I could find the courage to write a book, that this was going to be the story. I wrote this book for me.
Okay.
It was a passion for me. So I started doing it when I was 22, 23. I started doing the research. So you're talking about early, mid-90s, I started doing the research. But there was a challenge that I had. And the challenge was that I was a college graduate, so it meant I didn't have any money. I had college loans. I didn't have any money. I had a car payment. I had an apartment, rent. So I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. So it's really hard to do book research then. And I was chasing girls, and I was doing, all those things that 20-year-olds do. And so I was finding that going and doing the research on a Saturday wasn't enough. And that was all the time that I really had available. And most of the research of the time was happening in the library. And you'd get the microfiche or the microfilm, and you'd have to feed it through the machine and hope that somebody else hadn't already, checked it out. And so you would go and you would put in, this stuff. And then there was no cell phone back then to take pictures. Yeah. And so I had to take the notes in real time of everything that I wanted. And the process had such labor to it that I was like, I need to really put this aside.
And when you ended up writing the book, you ended up with like 300 references in the book. So
I had 300 references because times changed. Yeah. And I did a lot of my research from my couch because I could tap into library resources with a lot of things being digitized. Mm-hmm. And I was able to contact the court systems, and they had digitized... I had to read 3,000 pages of court transcripts from the trial. And so I had to go down by the JFK Library. There's the Commonwealth Museum, tremendous resource. And that was really one of the only things that I had to do on site besides going to historical societies. But everything else, time had changed from when I was in my early 20s. I'm in my early 50s now. And having access over the internet really changed the game for me to put some backbone behind it and actually tell the story.
So let's get into the story here a little bit. We'll put up a little summary of the plot here in there. But how did the machine guns and typewriters? There we go. We started with the fleecing of the state police thing, and goes on from stealing machine guns and using them and killing people.
Yeah, so the story really, it starts off as it's a national story, because there were surveys.
Crime of the century?
I'm sorry, what was that?
The crime of the century?
Well, yeah, there's, in the 20th century, how many crimes of the century did we have? There was probably
1933, you're getting there. But,
so there was probably one every 5 or 10 years, right? But nationally, if you looked at surveys and studies in the 1930s, if you looked at the top 5 concerns of the average American, prohibition was one, but the rest had to do with crime and safety and law enforcement. And those were 4 of the top 5 things, prohibition being one, and then everything else resolved around crime. You would think that people being out of a job would crack at least the top 10, but that came in at like 19 or 20.
Yeah.
So people weren't concerned about not having a job. Of course they were, but when it came to relating it to other things that were a priority in their life, they were dealing with fear. And they were dealing with prohibition, and they were dealing with the Al Capones of the world. And that was the threat. And then as you start moving into the early 1930s and prohibition was lifted, at the end of 1933, the gangsters were just as dangerous, but they moved from liquor to banks. They moved to cold, hard cash. And you would think that Chicago and New York led the way, and they probably did. But Boston wasn't far behind. There was a grip of fear in Boston because of the gangsters that were here. And what makes this story interesting to me is that you had a group of men with sinister values. They didn't care anything for human life.
Had these guys done banks before?
So they appeared out of nowhere. And it meant that they were no pictures. They had no pictures. They had no fingerprints. They were unmugged. And so they're not in the rogues gallery. So they were performing. They were knocking over little things at first, and as their courage grew, their ambitions grew.
And then they got the machine guns.
And so having the guns was very important to them. They were very meticulous about, we need to make sure that we're well planned, because other gangsters that get caught, it's because they did something stupid. And so they watched the movies and they read the headlines. And so they were on the other side. So we talked about that there was fear from Americans. With this group of people, it was almost like Robin Hood-esque.
Opportunity.
There was Bonnie and Clyde, they were coming in, and they were fans of these people that were doing these ruthless acts. And they were fans of them. And so this group started knocking over and started getting more and more courageous. But the first thing that they needed before they went for cash was, we need guns. If we're going to go in and we're going to be intimidated, we need guns. And after pulling a couple of jobs, they killed a theater manager in Lynn at the beginning of January 1934. In December of 1933, Ernest Clark in Fitchburg, he was the manager of a sporting goods store. They had guns in stock. They staked him out. They wanted to kidnap him and have him open up the sporting goods store. That was on December 11th, 1933. And they wanted to follow him home, kidnap him, bring him back to the store. Well, it went wrong. They ended up killing him cold-blooded in the street in front of witnesses.
And didn't get caught.
No one knew who they were, but the fear continued to grow.
Okay.
The end of January of 1934. So you've already had the theater in Lynn, the Paramount Theater. There was one civilian that was shot and killed, another that was shot and wounded. And you had Clark in Fitchburg in December. Well, then they started to get really ambitious, right? And so they went and the auto show that was at the Mechanics Hall on Huntington Ave in Boston, that auto show was flooded with people because the old fleet of the 1920s was aging and people needed new cars. And the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, he decided that this would be a great flex for the state police, and they brought out their newest paddy wagon as part of the auto show.
How did this get to machine guns?
Because the thing that was on display in front of that paddy wagon was their full arsenal of their Thompson submachine gun and riot guns.
And these guys stole them.
And these guys came in and saw an opportunity, and they went in the middle of the night and they fleeced it from the Massachusetts.
And now they had a
State
toy
Police.
to use.
And now they had one in their hands, and they were going to use it.
And it didn't take them long.
Only a few days later, they had scoped out a bank in Needham. A lot of these gangsters, they moved out of the cities pretty quickly because law enforcement had flooded the cities with patrolmen. And so they started moving out to the suburbs where there was just as much cash in the banks, but there was less police. And Needham was chosen because it was fairly close to Boston, and they liked the getaway routes, and they liked that there was a train that cut off traffic every morning at 9:30, just as the bank was opening. And that cutoff choked off traffic from both directions. And the other thing was that the bank whistle sounded exactly like the bank vault alarm if it was tripped. So there was a lot of different.
There was a lot of planning on this. Well, I think we may have to leave the rest to the readers of the book. I think you've got me pretty well into this already here, thinking about this. So but then they got caught.
Yep.
And we have a picture of them being marched away. What was their fatal mistake?
Their fatal mistake was the car that they used was a Packard. And the Packard, they decided they needed to burn it. Because when they fled the bank, they used a manager and a teller from the bank as human shields. So in 1933 and 1934, a Packard sedan had a runner on the side. And so they made human beings stand on the side and hold on to the car as they drove through the streets of Needham to escape. So everyone knew that they were looking for a black Packard. And so they decided the heat was on and they had to burn the car.
They burned the car and that's when they got caught?
They did not get caught then. Still unknown. But what was left over after the burning of the car was a battery. And that battery, it turns out, was not the typical battery that you would find in a Packard. And so through some investigative work between the state police and others, they determined that they need to find out who worked on this battery and who put this battery together, because whoever the mechanic was could probably tell us the name of the person. And what gets introduced there is the typewriter part of the story. You had, after the shooting in Needham when they fled, they used the Thompson submachine gun. And they turned it on police. And they gunned down 2 police officers. And that created panic in Needham. It would in any community.
And now they were murderers, as well as bank robbers.
And so now a manhunt was on. But there was chaos at the time as well.
And so the typewriters?
So the typewriters was, while the police were trying to put together their investigation, you had local police fighting with state police on who had jurisdiction. And so there was a lack of cooperation in the beginning of sharing of information. And it really, it was the opinion of many that it really gave a large head start to these gangsters. So there was a reporter from the Boston Globe named Joe Deneen, and there was a reporter from the Boston Post named Larry Goldberg. And these were 2 heavy hitter reporters for their respective papers back in the 1930s. Whatever the big crime case was, these 2 guys would be assigned it. And they saw the chaos that was happening and the struggle, the bureaucracy that was happening within the police ranks in the beginning of the investigation. So they decided, this goes against what our editors would ever allow us to do, but you and I have to put our heads together, and we need to go and start investigating ourselves and find some evidence. And they were the ones that went and found great leads of who worked on the battery and who actually had the work done on
And
the
the typewriters, though, were just the memos that they wrote between them?
Well, the typewriters is just, you know, the Thompson submachine gun, you know, outside of Boston was known as the Chicago typewriter. That was the nickname of it. And now you have two newspaper writers that are involved in this case.
Typing away.
That are typing away and typing the stories and working with and against police, trying to find out who these murderers were.
Okay. So why did you put this in a novel form instead of just the writing of the story itself?
So
did you use the real names of the characters?
I used the real names, and the reason that I did was because citizens died and patrolmen died, and I didn't want to dishonor their memory by embellishing the story. Even though it's a work of historical fiction, I tried to stay accurate to the story. And that's why you see that there's, you know, as many endnotes in there as there is. I want people to appreciate that I tried to stay as true to the story as not. Where I took liberties was information that I had. I created moments to help simplify something that might take 2 or 3 chapters to explain. I tried to condense it into a scene. So that was the drama that I helped bring to it.
Your television background coming to fore here.
Yeah, it's straight. Yeah, trying to take something simple and get it into a you know a 30-minute.
This would make a movie, wouldn't it?
You know, I've had a lot of people say that, and I do think that it's great.
You can see De Niro playing one of these parts.
It's great storytelling because the story really is one of those things that the fiction equals the truth. Like when you put them side by side, you just keep saying to yourself as you're reading through the story, this is unbelievable. I can't believe that happened. I can't believe the coincidence of a teletype that was online before the bank robbery and taken offline for budgetary reasons. We were talking about bureaucracy. But because of the threat of gangsters, they approved a new budget and said, no, we need to have the teletype online. Well, it was slated on February 2nd, 1934 to be installed in the afternoon. And the robbery was at 9:30 that morning. So the teletype installation was probably about 4 or 5 hours too late, and is one of many examples. The train whistle, like I mentioned before, the train whistle sounding exactly the same as the bank alarm. Those types of coincidences, if you made them up in complete fiction, you'd be like, oh, you're taking it a little too far. When you go and demonstrate, look at all these things that are actually true, I think it makes the story more compelling.
A lot of this stuff, well, it happened in 1933. 90 years later is still an issue today, isn't it? I mean, we've got issues with automatic guns. We've got issues with crime.
It's the parallels are incredible. That, you know, when we look at gun control today, you know, we talk about assault weapons, and in 1934 they were talking about assault weapons. They were talking about the Thompson submachine gun, and laws changed because of this crime. And the laws that changed nationally because of this particular crime at the Needham Bank Trust Company was because of the 2 police officers that were killed. And so the law that they put into place was anybody that was a citizen that was caught in a crime with a machine gun that they had illegally, automatic life term imprisonment. And so there's that. There, you know, we still talk about our values of for and against capital punishment. That was a big thing back in 1930.
And these guys, were they killed?
They were electrocuted.
They were?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a whole nother layer of that there are other people on trial for the robbery and murder at the Paramount Theater in Lynn. There were 2 men that went to trial for that. while the manhunt was going on for the Needham killers.
Oh.
And they weren't sure if these two men acted alone that were on trial in Lynn, or if they were part of this other gang that went on to perform the Needham bank robbery. So there was a little bit of, were they innocent? Were they very much involved? Were they leaders of the gang that performed this? So it does bring into play a lot of conflict about, you know, capital punishment.
Sure. Well, we're kind of running down on time here. I wanted to get a little bit into how you got this published. Did you use an agent? Did you do self-publish it? Or?
I thought about this long and hard, and I asked a lot of people about it. And I could have gone through traditionally. The way that I always have understood it is you can pitch it to an agent, but it's going to take you years to find an agent that's willing to take a gamble on a first-time writer.
Yes.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg type of thing. And then a publisher on top of that, once the agent gets it, they have to sell it to a publisher. And that can take up to 5 or 10 years. And I didn't want to wait for that, especially because the 90th anniversary was coming up as I was writing this. And so I decided to go the self-publishing route. And one of the things that I liked about it was it put more on my shoulders as far as responsibilities. But I worked with a company called Mindstar Media out of New Hampshire that was very supportive. They were in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And they were very supportive all steps of the way. But in the end, I controlled the destiny of the story, where if you get editors involved, for the good of the story, but also for the good of the publication.
Did you get Amazon involved in different ways? We have a picture of the cover of the book here.
Yeah, so...
it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, so Amazon, it's available on Barnes & Nobles. I've done probably 3 or 4 book signings now.
Which is where I met you.
Yep, at Barnes & Nobles. They have been so supportive at Barnes & Nobles for local writers. It's really incredible to see the support that Barnes & Nobles gives to people.
And you've gotten some great reviews, which we'll just summarize here on the screen.
Yeah, I'm humbled by that.
Yeah, and you showed me another one you just got today.
Yeah, that came from viral book reviews. They wrote a really incredible...
I like the last one about the way you made it a loving tale.
Yeah, which is hard to do when you're talking about murder and mayhem.
So what's next? We got about a minute to go here. So
what's next is a follow-up. So I told you I'd tease you.
Yes.
The Boston Globe reporter Joe Dineen is my great-grandfather.
Ah, okay.
And 30 years later, what I'm writing next that I'm outlining is he wrote about he really was involved in the Brinks robbery.
Ah, okay.
He wrote a bunch of books about it. And also as a writer, he had a column in the Globe that was called The Brinks Notebook.
Did they use machine guns?
There's machine guns in the story, so it really does stay with that. That's one of the links that brings the two together.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this here. I think we could have had an hour talking about this, but Rob, it's been great having you come over from Watertown to do this, and good luck with your book. And it's a fascinating title. I don't see how anybody could not get interested. And just when I saw that in Barnes and Noble, and when I walked and they said you were coming the next day, I said, oh, that's a guy I got to have on my show. So thanks for coming out and doing this, and thanks for writing the book, and thank you out there, folks in TV land, for taking some time to catch up with us this evening. Stay tuned. We're on 4 nights a week in Framingham. We have lots of interesting authors, and come back and watch us, and keep reading, and check this one out. Good night.